Do you think you're being shorted on miles? On this episode of Driven Too Far, we're going to tackle that number one complaint from drivers.
Hello, I'm Andrew Winkler, and this is Driven Too Far, the truth about trucking, a podcast that helps over-the-road truck drivers balance career and family.
On today's episode of the podcast, we're going to tackle the number one complaint by drivers, and that's to dispatch saying, I don't have enough miles, or I'm not getting the loads I want. Before we go there, I want to take you back just a little bit. And from time to time, I struggle just a little bit coming up with content or, gosh, what am I going to come up with next? But it almost never fails. If I just look within my own organization, a lot of times there's inspiration right there. And it just happened again last week. So I'm going to tell you a story about a driver named Joe. And Joe's not his real name, but Joe drives for my fleet. And Joe's a great guy. So I would consider him a top 5%er in the fleet. He's company OTR guy. He's active in the fleet. He lives by our core values with safety. He does everything right. He's on time. Like I said, he's active in safety meetings and company events, and he shows up when he should. He's a positive voice. But I can't help or I can't ignore the idea that once in a while he stops in and he'll drop a comment, maybe just in passing, or maybe he wants to discuss a little bit deeper, and it's usually about loads or miles. If he had one point where he's not always satisfied, that's it. So he's the inspiration for this episode today. And I've heard the same complaint for the almost 30 years that I've been in the business. And it's a driver basically saying, hey, I'm not getting enough miles. A couple of the other things that I hear once in a while in the fleet is maybe a certain group of drivers is getting preferential treatment on loads, or I can never get the long loads. I always get stuck with the short loads. But more often than not, it's just I'm not getting enough miles. So there it is, the low miles complaint. I think that's probably the biggest complaint I've heard over my entire career, and it didn't matter what carrier I was working for or associated with. That's just the way it is. Drivers equate their pay to miles, and why wouldn't they, right? When you think about it, most of you are paid by the mile. So when you're disappointed in the bank account on Friday of what you think is going to be there and it doesn't show up, you just come back to the miles thing and says, dispatch isn't getting me enough miles. That's why I'm not making the money I need to be making or expect to make. But I want to take a little bit deeper dive today into that, because I think it's more than just the miles. I kind of want to peel back the layers a little bit and see if we can't get to the root cause of that driver complaint with low miles. Drivers, like I said, they equate their pay to miles, and when the pay's short, they think it's because the miles are short, and that does make some sense. But I think that's maybe more of a symptom, and I think there might be some underlying causes if we look into it together. So that's my goal today, is to help you maybe understand when the paycheck is short, what's really going on there, and what's causing that at the root. The first thing a lot of drivers are noticing today, specifically in this market, in the place we're in right now, is freight has slowed down on a national level right now. There's not as much demand for the trucks as there has been over the last couple years, and drivers are feeling that. Probably at your company too, where the freight, there just isn't quite as much freight in the network for your carrier. And then maybe it's even taken more time between loads. So you're kind of feeling that, where, when things are hustling and things are busy, as dispatch is on you, they may have your next couple loads planned ahead for you because we got to go. The customers are really pushing us, and there's a lot of demand for our services. So if that is truly the case, or the cause of our low income is just slower freight, lower miles per week and stuff, what exactly is the fix, and how do we get to that? One of the things I would recommend you do is, first of all, I think it's got to start with communication, and that's between you and your dispatcher, driver manager, fleet manager, whatever you call it at your company. But when things get slow, you need to increase the amount of communication you have with your dispatcher. One of the things that's going to happen, and the way I always did it was, the squeaky wheel, so to speak, gets the grease, right? But you want to be top of mind with your dispatcher. So If you know you're getting empty and you're running on time, make sure they know that. Call your dispatcher a couple times a day or message or however your company does it. But make sure when more loads come into the system and new loads come into the system, make sure you're top of mind with your dispatcher so they know, oh, Joe was asking for a longer load, so let's get him on this. If you never speak up and never say anything, there's a good chance you're just going to get whatever they throw you. And there's a good chance you're probably not going to be happy with some of that. Make sure you're doing a good job communicating your arrival times. Let your dispatcher know, hey, I'm on time. I've got hours to run, so as soon as I'm empty, I'm ready for my next assignment. Watch your hours, make sure you're communicating hours. So whether you have hours to burn or maybe you don't, maybe you're running tight on hours, make sure your dispatcher knows that. So the more communication you have, the better they can plan for you. And I think the one piece of advice I'd give to, it doesn't matter if you're a company guy, owner, operator, whatever that is, but just be a little bit more aggressive with your communication. And by aggressive, I mean more frequent and with purpose. But it doesn't mean you have to be a jerk or anything like that, like you're demanding stuff, but just be a little more aggressive in the way you communicate with your dispatcher. Again, you got to stand up for yourself. If you're not there specifically asking for what you want and making sure your dispatch is clear, and they've probably talked to 25 other drivers since the last time they talked to you, you got to continuously talk to that dispatcher and make sure that you're top of mind and they know exactly what you're looking for. So when it does pop up, you're the first person they'll call. Low miles are certainly a reason why your income could be down, but there's something else that almost never gets brought up. I think the low miles thing it's right on the surface, and that's where most drivers take it. But I want to talk about time, because as a driver, you exchange your time for income. And what's unique about you getting paid by the mile is even when you're exchanging that time for income is you're not, unless the wheels are turning, you're not getting paid. And you certainly know that. And your dispatcher knows that as well. But lost time, you need to think about this. Lost time is also a lost opportunity for income. So one of the things I want to make clear on this is that I'm not taking sides at all. I'm neutral in this, and I'm trying to look at this objectively, saying, okay, the complaint from the driver is I'm not getting enough miles. What I think the driver is actually telling me, or what I believe you're trying to relay, is that I'm not happy with my income. So just because you say miles doesn't mean that's really what's going on. A better way for you to present that to your dispatcher, your operations manager, whoever you're going to talk to, is I need to talk about my income. My income is not meeting my expectations, and we need to figure out together what's the reason for that. So low miles could certainly be a part of that, but I think what you're going to find out is the time is probably even a bigger issue, because it works both for you and the company. You both have to be focused on time to make sure we're efficiently using your available hours as a driver. So where could you be losing time as a driver? Trucking is certainly not a perfect industry, and we know that. If you've worked in it for any amount of time, it's imperfect. It's got a lot of inefficiencies, and part of the reason for that is there's so many moving parts. If we as a truck line could actually control every aspect of our business, we could become a lot more efficient at it. But the reality is you're relying on equipment to work. You're relying on shippers and receivers to keep their word for appointments and shipping schedules. There's the weather, there's the traffic. There's just so many different pieces that have to all come together to make sure you have a good, successful trip. Sometimes it's very difficult to do that. One of the things I want to do is talk about what's in your control and what's not in your control as a driver. So first of all, let's just knock out the things that are not in your control. Weather, traffic, certainly are not in your control. A lot of times the shippers, receivers, whatever that is, you show up on time like you're supposed to, they're not ready for you. There's some kind of delay there. it's probably best if you look at it and say, you know what, those things are out of my control. They're not worth the stress. So just stop stressing about those things. But what I would like to focus on is the things you can either control or have a significant impact on, because those are the things, if you start to control the things you can or have impact on, then those are the things that are also going to impact your overall income. And that's really what we're trying to do, is maximize your income. So what do you have control over? First of all, you have control over you. And what I mean by that is you have 100% control of how you react to situations and how you handle them. You have control over your time. Now, where you may not have control over other people's time and how they influence you, you certainly have control over your time, meaning how you decide to use your day, how you decide to use your hours of service. When you're at home time, when it's time to go back to work, you do have control over those things. You have control over safety in the way that you can be responsible for your own actions. So make sure you're never taking shortcuts when it comes to safety. Do the things you should be doing as a professional driver. Equipment's kind of a tough one, but I definitely feel like you have influence over how reliable your equipment is. So they're mechanical pieces. We don't know if they're going to break down, but when you think about your job as a driver to do your pre and post trips every day, you certainly have an impact on that. So you could skip that 10 or 15 minute pre-trip in the morning. You could pencil whip it like a lot of people do and say you did it. But did you actually get out and look for potential issues? Because as soon as you start your trip and you get down the road and you have a breakdown, I can almost guarantee you that flat tire or whatever the problem is going to take you hours to fix, which is a heck of a lot more than the 15 minutes it might have cost you to catch it ahead of time and address it right then and there. So you certainly have while you can't prevent all mechanical failures, you certainly have an impact in the ability to catch some of those ahead of time, which will save you money. And let's face it, if you can catch those things and you don't have as much downtime, that's going to impact your income. And that's really what we're talking about here, is how do we maximize your income every week? That's what we're talking about here with the trucks. As long as you're doing your pre-trips and your post-trips and you're actively trying to catch those potential hazards or breakdowns before they happen, you're going to end up saving time, and it's going to put more money in your pocket. Communication. You definitely have 100% control over your communication with your company, whether you're dealing with maintenance, safety, operations, whoever it is, even the shippers and the receivers. Now, we can't control how they communicate or the lack of their communication that may cause delays, but at least do your part. Step up and make sure you're doing everything you can to communicate so people know exactly where you're at, you're running on time, exactly when you're going to arrive, and how many hours you have when you get unloaded. So I want to go back to the story of Joe, my driver, a little bit and tell you. So for a couple weeks, so Joe's, when he's in the office, he usually makes a point to stop in and just say hello. Sometimes he comes in and wants to visit a little bit. Sometimes it's just checking in. He's just a good guy. He wants to know what's going on. So I appreciate that about him. But I can't ignore the times that I've heard him say, even if it's in passing, that he's either not happy with his miles, or he feels like another group of drivers is maybe getting preferential treatment with the loads, and he's missing out, and he doesn't feel like that's fair. So after he left this last week, and I kind of heard it again, I go, listen, man, I got to get to the bottom of this. What is really going on? Is there really a dispatch issue going on where there's somebody else getting, what he calls good loads? Or is that just a perception of his because of, is it driver talk? Is it something else that's going on? You can't put it above driver to kind of brag, so to speak, and maybe even embellish some things sometimes. And I'll just tell you guys that drivers mess with you sometimes. So take a lot of it with a grain of salt. It's not always true. Some guys really get off on just, messing with other drivers and seeing if they can get them wound up. So don't always fall for that. And if you do think there's an issue, then at least take the time to go talk to your dispatcher or somebody in your office and say, listen, I keep hearing this. Is this really the case, or what's going on here? So anyways, take it with a grain of salt. So back to Joe anyways, again, I owe it to him, right? I want to find out what's going on. Is there merit to what he's saying, or is it a perception issue on his part? And regardless of what it is, I don't care if it's a driver issue or a dispatch issue. I want to be able to fix it and help him so he doesn't feel like he's missing out on something. So the first thing I do usually when I have a driver talk to me about low miles is I'll pull a report, right? I'm looking at 30, 60 days worth of history. And the initial report I pulled had origin, destinations, pickup dates and arrival dates, and the miles, loaded and empty miles. And that's about all it has. So it wasn't super detailed, but I could definitely see a 60-day history of where he'd been, what he's doing. And when I look at the dates, a lot of times you can pick up on large gaps in the dates. So what I can figure out pretty quickly is when they go home. When I see several days, between a delivery and the next ship date, I go, okay, it looks like he was near his house. This must have been his home time for that week, whatever it was. So I did that, and I found 3 different areas where he was headed home over that 60-day period. And Joe usually goes home every 2 weeks. So I was a little bit surprised there wasn't a 4th, but there wasn't. It didn't tell me everything I wanted to know. What I want to know is I actually needed specific times in there, because what I was starting to think was, if his arrangement with dispatcher's expectation was I run for 2 weeks, I go home for 3 days. So it looks like dispatch is hitting that home time, but what I was seeing was much larger gaps when he went home. It wasn't 3 days, it wasn't even 4 days. What I was seeing was 5 days, 6 days when he was going home. I said, okay, now we're on to something. Because if his expectation is that, he's going to run 2 weeks at a time, take 3 days off, and then all of a sudden he's taking extra home time, that's costing him money. Now, I don't know who's responsible for that, whether he's requested that, whether dispatch sent him home early, or maybe didn't get him out of the house when they were supposed to. So I'll find all that stuff out. But the first step was just identifying the issue that he's taken more time off than he should or is scheduled to do. What's that cost? Well, as an over-the-road company driver, you should be making $200 to $300 per day in income. So all of a sudden, if you're taking 2 extra days every time you swing through the house, that's $600. It's $500, $600, something like that. That's not hitting your paycheck. And remember, what started this complaint and this issue was I'm not making enough money. I'm not making the income that I think I should be making. And the initial thought was it's because my miles are too low. Well, he may be right there, because if you're spending a couple extra days at the house every time you go home, that's 2 days you didn't run miles, and that's 2 days worth of income you never earned. So what I don't know yet is whether dispatch was sending him home early, whether something happened at the house. So I've got some more investigating to do, but it was good to find that and understand that. What I've seen happen, not with this guy specifically, but if our guys go home every 2 weeks, it's like sometimes we get close to the house and we're scheduled for our home time within the next couple days. Sometimes dispatch will send him home early. Well, I couldn't find him another short load to keep him moving, so I just sent him home early. That's okay, but keep in mind it's going to cost somebody. It's going to cost the company revenue on the truck or on the asset, and it's going to cost the driver money in his bank account. So if you go home early, or if dispatch sends you home early, are you willing to come out of the house early? That's really the discipline that you need to have as a driver. I know it's hard to do. You go home and it's that emotional connection with the family, the kids, the wife, whatever it is. You haven't seen them for 2 weeks. Gosh, yeah, you want to spend all the time you can with them. Of course you do. But there's a consequence to that. And you have to figure out if that consequence is worth it. So the consequence is you're going to have a shorter paycheck. And is that going to cause more issues for you a week from now when the pay comes out and it's short? It's not what it should be. Is it going to put you in a tight space when it comes to paying the bills? So really, I think the advice is have an arrangement with your family, understanding, listen, I'm going to go out and work this amount of time. I'm going to come home for this amount of hours or specific days, whatever it is. And as soon as that time's up, I've got to get back to work. I've got to climb back in the truck because, you guys are counting on me. We got to pay the bills. We got to pay the rent and all those things like that. The other thing that kind of comes out of that when I get ready to ask the questions. So maybe I find out the dispatch is sending him home early because, we didn't have anything on the board to keep him busy for another day or two before he went home. So it was just easier to send him home. I get it, but that's not fair to the driver. And it's not helping us pay for the asset either. So if that's the case, then I certainly have to have a talk with our operations group and just show them what that decision is costing us. And if you send them home early, great. Try to get them out of the house early too. So we're limiting the amount of home time and the downtime on the asset itself. When I looked at Joe's detailed history and I was looking at the times, the other thing I did see in there too, it wasn't all about the home time. I did see some inefficiencies with the dispatch, meaning there was too much time between dispatches. So I've got to have a conversation with operations. I've got to make them aware of that. And when the planners and the driver managers are, they're working with 30, 35 guys or gals a day. They don't always take that next step they need to when they think about how is this decision affecting our drivers and their income and how could I do that different? So we definitely need to make our operations people aware of those gaps and what that actually costs. Now, maybe they've done everything they could to reasonably, get that truck moving again, and there just wasn't the freight there. So that could certainly happen. If I was a driver in that situation, and if I'm doing everything I should be doing as a driver, I'm on time, I'm running the miles you give me, and dispatch can't find me that next load, or they find me the next load, but maybe it doesn't pick up till tomorrow. Remember when I said stand up for yourself? Well, that means right there saying, listen, Mr. Fleet Manager, I'm here. I've got hours I'm ready to go. I just need my next assignment. And if they don't have it for you, then I think it's fair that you ask the company to compensate you for that. Be compensated for the time you're ready to work. That's on them. They've got to step up and own that problem. And if your company isn't doing that, or you're not asking for that compensation, they're probably going to continue to run over the top of you and not pay you those things. So you have to ask. This is that area where you got to stand up for yourself, and you're not asking for anything out of line. You're just saying, hey, I just want to be compensated for the time I'm ready to work, and you couldn't find me the load. When you go home as a driver, honor your home time schedule with your dispatcher. And this is I don't know if drivers realize this or not, but I think one of the things that happens is driver goes home maybe on a Friday, and he says, I'll be ready Monday morning. One of the things we try to coach our team to do is we say, before that driver goes home on Friday, make sure he or she knows what his next load is Monday. And our expectation is when you're coming out of the house on Monday, that means 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday, not 10 or 1 when you kind of get up and around. No, you're ready to work on Monday. So if we have that next pickup information ready for you, that's the expectation, that you're going to climb in the truck Monday morning and you've got your load. You already know where you're going, what you're doing. Specifically with owner operators, this happens, but it also happens with company guys too, but they kind of let the time creep on them. Yeah, Monday comes around and boy, I'm not really feeling it. Or maybe the kids, don't want you to leave, or put a little emotional pressure on you. But you have to be disciplined to do that. You have to be ready to go. So one of the things I see, though, is drivers calling dispatch or sending a message because they don't want to call and say, I'm not feeling well today. I'll pick up on Tuesday. Okay. I mean, maybe that's the case. Maybe you're not feeling good. And if that's the case, from a safety perspective, we don't want you out on the road either. But if you keep abusing that every time you go home, we're going to see that pattern. And I want you to understand that you just cost yourself $300 for the day. Because remember, that's your daily revenue as a company guy. If you're an owner operator, it's probably much higher than that, at least double that, or maybe even more. That's revenue you didn't put on your business or your truck, and it's time, which means you're never going to get it back. So this whole idea that I'm gonna put in for 3 days off and I'll stretch it to 4, I'll stretch it to 5, or I'll decide not to pick up the phone when dispatch calls, don't do it. I'd tell you, in our organization, we wouldn't put up with that very long. So don't do it. It's not worth it. Be honorable. Honor that home time when you go home. We're already looking for a load for you to come out of the house before you ever step foot in the house. And that's the way it needs to work. We need to try to be as efficient as possible for both of us. What about the complaint about longer miles? Most guys I know enjoy the longer runs. We're flatbed carriers, so I know specifically for us that's the case, because when you do the short runs or the regional runs, that means the driver's touching the freight, touching the trailer, he's tying down, he's securing the load, and you're doing that more often, like on a daily basis. If you can get a nice long run, 1,200, 1,500 miles, then maybe it's 2 or 3 days before you have to touch that load and that trailer again. So I certainly understand that. But what I do want you to understand is short miles are not necessarily a bad thing. Now, in our case, we compensate drivers a lot of different ways. So they're going to get their mileage pay. They're probably going to get a mini pay, something, anything under 400 miles. We throw an extra $100, $200 bill at them to help compensate for the short miles. And what we're trying to do is compensate them for a full day's work. So you have 11 hours worth of driving you technically could be doing. We want to make sure that you're earning that 10 or 11 hours worth of work. Even if you only had to drive 5 hours for the day, there's got to be something extra in it for you. You have to earn a full day's wage. That's not your fault that the freight we had was short, but it's customer freight. We need to move it regardless. So the point is, long loads are great, but don't judge things by the miles of the load, the length of the load. Focus on the income per day that you're making as a driver. So if you're going to make $250, $300 for a nice 500-600 mile day, then you should be able to make that same kind of income if you're having a short load for the day. Maybe you're only running 250 miles for the day, something like that. Ask dispatch for extra compensation to make up that gap. That's not your fault that that's all they had on the board was the shorter mile stuff, and we shouldn't hold that against our drivers. So I'm anxious to get back, and I'll have a conversation with Driver Joe before this episode airs. But it's a conversation that we need to have together, and I think it's going to be a discovery process with he and I talking, with the understanding that it's probably a little bit of both is what's going on. It's probably a little bit of him throwing an extra day or two in there with his home time going on there. And then, like I said, I know we identified some inefficiencies in operations where there was just a little bit too much lag or time between being empty and that next load. So I think while we work together, we can accomplish that. Now, if I was to circle back and kind of summarize everything we just talked about, the point I was trying to make is drivers like to complain about low miles, or that's their number one complaint, but it may not be the case. Let's make it perfectly clear that your real complaint is that I'm not making the money. I'm not making the income that I need to. And then sit down with your dispatcher, your operations manager, somebody you trust in the organization to work through it. Let's get the data and let's figure out what's really going on here. Because if we get to the root cause of the issue, then we can fix it together. Thanks again for joining us on this episode. To check out all our driver resources, visit us at driven2far.com.